Bruce Edgerly here, co-founder and vice president of Backcountry Access here in Colorado. We're going to talk today about advanced transceiver searching. We define that as any time there's more than two buried victims. 1 to 2 victims can be fairly straightforward, and that represents about 95% of scenarios. So we're going to talk about the 5 percentile now. And this is something mainly for guides and advanced recreationists and transceiver nerds like myself. Generally with the modern digital Avalanche transceiver, you're going to have indicators on the transceiver about approximately how many victims are buried. You're going to at least know that there's more than one. They're not always perfectly accurate, but you'll have an idea of how complicated the scenario is. On the tracker 3, we'll tell you that there's 2, and if there's 3, there's a plus sign. And we'll also tell you on the display if you have a close proximity situation. That's when you'll see brackets around 2 of the victims. It's these close proximity situations that can be tricky, especially if there's 3 or more victims. One thing to note about the tracker 3 is that we can suppress 1 signal. We can't suppress 2, 3, and 4 signals, and we always bring you to this next strongest signal. Once there's 3 or more transmitting victims all within range of each other in a avalanche scenario, there's several complicating factors that can come into play. Probably the biggest one is signal overlap. When there's more than 2 victims out there and they're all beeping, the chances are fairly high that after a while their beeps are going to overlap with each other. So instead of beep, 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 it's going to be going beep, beep, beep all together. And when that happens, most digital avalanche transceivers will think, oh, there's only 1 out there now, because it can only hear 1. So it will miscount the number of victims out there. Also, it will affect the marking function, or in our case, the suppression function of your transceiver. It makes it difficult to suppress a signal while there's an overlap. And if you did suppress a signal during that overlap or mark a signal, that victim can actually come back when that overlap ends. The more transmitting victims there are out there, the more and the longer the overlaps are going to be, and the more problems you're likely to have. Then you mix in some of the issues involving electromagnetic noise, false triggers being counted as another victim, reduced range because of noise. These things all can complicate scenarios. That's why we say with 1 and 2 transmitters out there, it can be fairly straightforward. But once you get 3, 4, 5 or more, the reliability can really decrease. Fortunately, 95% of complete burials involve 1 to 2 victims. So we're really just talking about the 5 percentile here. If you're a guide leading large groups and people are depending on you to know how to use your transceiver really well, it's important to have a quiver of techniques to use. Marking or suppression, big picture, and then what we call signal strength techniques. Signal strength techniques don't use marking and suppression features. They rely on signal strength isolation, where you walk through the debris pile in a very systematic pattern and rely on the ability of your transceiver to isolate signals. When you get closer to each one, it locks you into the closest signal. In most avalanche situations, you're going to have a general idea of where people were taken within the debris. There will be possibly some last seen areas, and you're going to know where you can go after you find the first victim to go find the next one, and just use signal strength to isolate each one without pressing any buttons. But sometimes you may not have an idea of where any of the victims are, or where the next one is after you find the first victim. So there are ways that you can do a systematic search through the debris to get through that debris and find each victim as you go through when they become the closest signal. One method that's used mainly in Europe is the 3-circle method. After you find the first victim, you stay in search mode, take 3 steps back and walk in a circle around that victim, preferably with your transceiver on the snow surface. If you get closer to another signal at that time, at that point, then it'll isolate that next closest signal and you found the second victim. If you do 1 circle and you still haven't picked up another victim, then go back to the original circle that you made and take 3 steps back, do it again. See if you run into another signal. If you do, if you pick up another signal and you know because there's a change in cadence and you can see that the signal jumps back and forth, isolate that signal. Let's say you complete that second circle and you still haven't found another victim. Take another 3 steps back and walk in a 3rd circle. If you haven't found that next victim by then, well, that means you can go back to your original signal search. You go back to the point at which you committed to the first victim signal and continue zigzagging through the debris in your systematic search strip widths, generally 40 meters or less, until you cover the entire debris pile. Eventually, you'll run into that next victim just when they're closer than that first victim was. Another technique that we like to use for complicated scenarios of 3 or more, where you're not using special functions and pushing buttons, but you're searching based on signal strength, is the Microstrip Method. This is where you just shrink up your normal 40-meter search strips during the signal search phase of the search and shrinking them down to, say, 5 meters and zigzagging through in 5-meter strips and not committing to any one signal until the distance reading is 5 meters or less. Of course, when your distance readings are that low, that's when you want to get down on the ground and you enter the fine search phase, and you're bracketing while you're doing this kind of search. Remember always to go back to the point at which you abandoned your signal search pattern and resume your search from there every time so that you don't miss any areas in the debris pile. How do I know when to start doing these micro search strips? Well, generally you don't need to do them unless you know you have a close proximity burial situation. So either you're going to have an idea because there were 2 people that were swept off their feet together and they were going down through the debris together, maybe into a terrain trap of some kind, or your close proximity indicator is showing either with the flashing light of the Tracker 2 or with the brackets on your Tracker 3. So if you're doing your 40-meter search strip widths and all of a sudden your close proximity indicator comes up, that's when you want to start shrinking those search strip widths down. Keep in mind that multiple burials are all different. A lot of the multiple burial discussions that occur involve a situation involving guided groups where one person, the guide, has the best transceiver skills of them all, and he relies on the guests to shovel. But if you're in a recreational group that's pretty good with their transceivers and they've been practicing a lot, why not use that manpower to help with the transceiver search? Line them up across the debris. If you have enough people, hey, you could make search strips 5 meters between each person and then just comb through the debris. Each person probably picking up a separate signal unless they're buried on top of each other. The key to this is to make sure that not everybody converges all on the first transmitter. The rule is if there's 5 meters between each person, well, keep searching, and once you have a signal, you know, if you pick up a signal at 40 meters, don't just chase it. Stick to your search strip, and once that number gets to 5 meters or less, then commit to that signal. That'll keep everybody in their lanes and prevent people from converging all on the first victim. These kinds of situations are also a great opportunity to use your big picture mode. If you come upon a scenario and you just want to try to get a handle on how many burials are within range and generally how far away they are, go into that big picture for a few seconds and see what kind of numbers and directions you come up with. And that's a great way for you to start allocating resources. If you'd like to set up a time for some training with a BCA specialist, give us a call or send us an email.